Hey guys, Baileywiki here. We're going to do a dungeon draft tutorial today. This is really just a design session. I'm designing something for my castle expansion. I'm going to show you guys how I do this. I'm using a very particular palette of artists' stuff, including my own custom asset packs. And I'm going to show you how to do this level of detail with all of this like script and writing and these inlays and all of this really interesting background artwork and how to make these floors look more interesting. I'm going to explain why there's green in the background and how I'm going to be using these in VTT. And I've got a little heads up display to show you, try to show you at least what buttons I'm pressing as we go in case you get a little bit lost or don't know how I did something in particular. I hope this helps you guys out. It's not going to be perfect, but that's going to be the session today. So if you'd like to, I'm going to talk along as I go and you can follow me with the different things that I'm doing. Here's the palette I'm using some of my own asset packs. I'm using some AOA stuff. And then Epsilon is this new artist that I found. He's got a commercial license, which is great because that means I can use it and show you guys. I'm using a little bit of Forgotten Adventures. And then I'm going to use, of course, Krager's Shadow and Light pack, and then some Tom Kartos' stuff. And so, but Epsilon's going to be the biggest piece of this palette here that I think is really interesting, along with some of the new stuff that I've got produced here. So what we're going to do is, first I'm going to just get the hex code of the wall that I've been using. This happens to be a Tom Kartos wall. I like it. It's clean, real simple. You can shade it. It starts off as a light color, so that means you can make it lots of different colors, so I like that. And we're going to just start by engaging our spline tool, and we're going to create actually 4 separate quadrants. This is not a contiguous circle on purpose because I'm going to break this apart. The new Dungeondraft does have the ability to split a wall in the middle, so technically I don't have to do it this way, but I know I'm going to split them, so I'm just starting by splitting them. And again, it's just a spline to try to make it a perfect circle here. And then what I'm going to do is hover over some of these lines and move them out, because what I want to go for with this release is some really interesting shapes of rooms, right? It's really easy to do a lot of square rooms and things like that, but I want these rooms to be very different in their size and shape because of how I want to use them in the VTT. I want to be able to link other things to them and overlay them on top of each other. And so just by creating some odd shapes, that'll lend itself well to doing that kind of thing. And so I'm just in edit mode for the wall tool, and I'm just dragging these things out so they look relatively symmetrical. Notice I'm deleting lines to get back to a certain point. Here's where I want the sort of the main hallway to enter into the room. And I've got snap to grid on. And I'm just making sure my points are relatively the same between the top and the bottom there. Notice that I have my background full, right? So I have the background texture terrain tool active, and you're looking at one of Epsilon's textures back there. It's a stone texture. There's a reason that I'm doing that and why there's green all over the screen. That green is really what I call a green screen. And that is so that I can export this later and cut all of that green out. The reason I do that is so I can get really interesting textures on my floor. The pattern tool that comes with Dungeondraft is awesome. I use it all the time, and I use it for floors all the time too, but it can't give you all of this variation that you can get when you paint these terrains in using the terrain brush. So we're just starting with one basic terrain background, and I'll show you how I vary that up here in a little bit. Again, I'm going for a variation of shapes. I want something that's interesting for players to move through. This is going to be like kind of a long room, longish room with maybe multiple rooms technically. And I want things to be able to hide enemies or, put a statue, because I will do a lot of the decorating of this map. In fact, I'm making decor items for this set that are separate so that they can be dropped in after the fact. So I want this room to be relatively generic, able to be used in a lot of different types of motifs and storylines. And then the decoration of it itself will be done largely inside the VTT Foundry in this case. So I'm feeling pretty good. You notice I also, when I built this wall, I built it in segments just so I could have it easily change later if I want to change some of these things. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to level 400. It's just under the wall line. And I'm going to create the green screen behind this, or around this shape here. Just following the same general shape I did before. I'll break it up into pieces so it's a little bit more manageable. And there, I've got a section done. And I'll be going back to that color green just so I can make sure my greens are all consistent, because when I do some post-processing later, I just want to be able to grab all of those green colors and delete them. I realize I want this room hanging off of this hallway to be a little bit more interesting. If you're always and only ever building, square rooms, you'll find that it's just you can start to get a little monotonous. So we're trying to kind of vary that up a little bit. And I don't want everything to be symmetrical. I want this room to be a little bit different than the room down below. Maybe this leads to a staircase, or maybe it leads to enemy or a lever. These are all things that I can place in once I get it into the VTT, and I can reuse this map 100 times with lots of different adventures. I'll even show you how I'm going to make it recolorable and do some other things with it that just really extend its usefulness to me or to any GM who's using it in their toolkit. And again, just more variation of these different rooms. You could put torches or statues back there, any number of things, but just makes it more interesting. This is meant to be a room in a castle, although it could just as easily be, a room in a dungeon, that kind of thing. And we'll continue on with our green screen now that we've got our rooms situated. If you're not familiar with the spline tool, I'm just holding down Shift after I, click the mouse button, and that's what lets me engage that spline. Now that we got that far, now we want to add a little bit of depth to our map. So I'm going to go down to the Krager's 50% medium path. I'm going to leave it at a width of 1, and I'm at level 400. So I'm right below the wall line with this. And I'm going to just trace a path of shadow all along the wall. This is going to give me instantly a sense of depth with my map. I'm being careful not to create any, or at least not too many, of that kind of hedgehog effect where you get the shadow that's overlapping. I'm trying to stay really with right angles as much as possible, and I'm looking out for where I'm creating that sort of spiked shadow effect. I want to avoid that in general. Can't always do it. So I'm using, different line segments. I'm not necessarily forcing myself to maintain a contiguous line or contiguous path if I feel like I'm running in danger of that. But in general, I'll just do this for the rest of the map. So now we've got our sense of depth for the space. I'm evaluating and figuring out, what I think would be interesting as far as being able to manipulate the space. And the first thing I want to do is I want to create a more varied floor. So this floor it's too monotonous, right? There's just like one sort of floor, and you can see what I've done in the other rooms is I'm using this black color. So what I'm using is the blank pattern, and it's set to black. And then I've faded it to 100 is the value. And I'm using 100 as a specific value so it's easy to remember, because I'm going to want to use the same technique and the same color variation later. So again, it's the blank pattern. If you didn't know, you can actually put down just normal colors, just solid colors using the blank pattern. And if you fade it out, then you get this nice faded effect, which you see here. So now I've got this sort of darker part of the floor, right? And it makes it look like there's a trim running around the edge of it. And I'm going to use this to create that trim effect in various parts of this room here. I will be cutting into that in a little bit. Really important to try to get your spline just right along those curves. I'm using snap to grid here, but I will disengage snap to grid sometimes if I feel like it's really needed. I just want to make sure that curve looks right against its wall. If you didn't know, when you engage your spline tool and you're going around curves, you can engage your spline tool again to make that corner a really sharp corner. Otherwise, it'll try to curve on you, and you can see it just very subtly as I'm drawing these around these corners. It's trying to curve, so I hit my shift tool and I go double back on that path, and it'll actually make it straight. And you can see the effect that this has. It's really starting to feel like there's different materials here, like it's really been, properly built using those materials. There's a separation between them. That's why I'm using this very small, thin shadows to be able to create that effect. Now what I want to do is I want to cut into this. This is still too monotonous, this space. So I'm cutting into it, and I'm making just a general shape here that I can drop in an inlay. Now I'm going to use some of my assets here. These are part of my overlays. I'm turning it white so I can see them better on the right side. But I'm just looking at different shapes that might be available to me. I'm going to try to look for something that's more of this kind of solid pattern. I'm going to drop it to the same black and 100, just like I did my floor. That way I know that they're the same opacity. And you can see now this object, this sort of crescent moon object, is now in the center of my map. Going back to my pattern tool, now I want to surround this object with, I want to frame it in a black circle. So I'm doing it in 2 pieces because otherwise it would close on my shape for me. And that's how I can make it look like, some artist came in and sort of stamped this pattern in the middle of this concrete. Now what I want to do is use some script. These are more assets from my pack. And script and like writing, I have different like types of embossed and engraved writing. I've got metallic writing. And I want to just, it's just such a great effect. It's such a good detail to have writing, especially in a place like this where it's occupied by intelligent creatures, right? I have Dwarven script and Elvish, and we've even got things that, kind of modeled after Sanskrit and other types of writing. I don't want English, right? I want something that looks interesting and sort of foreign. And I'm just playing around with how these scripts look. I'm using the engraved versions here. And I'm just now selecting my path and shrinking it down just so it kind of hugs that circle in a way that I want. See, I've got these embossed components as well, and I'm just kind of looking at like what could look really interesting here in this space. I want it to feel like the floor has this sort of tactile element. Here, I've got colorable versions of these, so I can make it just really slightly colored. I think that looks really good. I think it looks like maybe there's a little a different material being used here for this embossed component. It picks up the materials underneath it, which is why I really like these. And just more experimentation, how I want to decorate this or not. I'm just looking at how do these shapes interact with other parts of the map. You can see how this looks like it's sort of inlaid in the floor and the stairs are still going over it. I kind of like that effect. I'm not going to use it in this case, but I'm taking note of how these things work from a design perspective because I may want to use some of these ideas in the future. Again, I'm just seeing how some of these shapes sort of interact with shadows above them. Probably at least 30% of my design time is just experimenting with assets to see all the things that they can do. Not necessarily what they were designed for, but maybe a lot more than what they were designed for. So we're back to 30%. You see I'm at level 100 here. I want my stairs to be relatively low to the ground, but not all the way down because I may want to put things underneath them. I'm trying to decide whether I want my stairs to go from one wall to the other, or if I want them to be sort of in the middle somewhere, like I did that top stair. Back to edit points. This is another really, really valuable tool from Epsilon. I'm setting my path to 0.5, and I'm selecting this kind of pale, imperfect line. This is a great, great line to put at the edge of a stair, like you see here, any kind of physical surface. It really catches the light, helps show that there's some real depth there, and I just really, really like it. I've got the end set to fade, although you can't really tell as I approach the walls here. That's where most of the fading is occurring. You can see I'm also applying it to this same trim, and you can see the effect is pretty immediate, especially as it's faded there. You see that now it kind of fades on the edges. It really looks like there's a material here, and it's really catching the light. So really great work from Epsilon, just a super useful tool. You can see there's different gradations of this. You can have highlights that are higher or lower in their effect. And there's even black lines, black versions of this that you can create better outlines in separation between materials and things like that. Well, it's looking pretty good. This looks like a real engineered space. Just adding my missing shadows there. And we'll do the same thing for this room. Now what I'm doing is I'm copying that whole floor. Hit Control C, then Control V to paste it. And there's this other, I believe this is from Epsilon also. I think it's because he's got such great rock textures. I want to turn those into tiles. So this is a pattern that is just a tile pattern. It's an overlay. And I'm just having to get to this other background pattern. I want that pattern to kind of lay over everything. I want even the embossed component to look like it's built of tile. So these are tiles with the embossment actually, maybe built into them. And a lot of the design work is just remembering the rules that you're following, right? Just be consistent, right? If I'm going to have that light on other places, I want to have it there. And I want that same tile look here. I'll do the same in the other room. I had to change, notice it kept engaging my comparison tool. That was a really a crazy design decision. I think that was the default hotkey for comparison was Control C, but obviously that's also the copy function. So I go in later and change that. Now what we're doing is we're in our terrain brush, and I'm looking at the different rock textures and things. And I've got this palette already created, and I'm just showing you what some of them are. I've got a darker rock, a lighter rock, and then this rust, which is really just an even lighter rock texture. And I'm going around and I'm painting these variations here. And while it may seem subtle to you, it's a pretty powerful effect. It gets rid of any repeated patterns that you can see. It really lightens up areas that you want to be sort of visible or accessible. And you can see it creates all these subtle shadows, and it just makes the scene look really true, like true to real life, like how light would really land on these surfaces. So, and by the way, we're in blending mode. I don't normally turn that on, but for Epsilon stuff, blending mode really works well. It's for him, it's really more about blending colors together and things like that. I've done a lot with Forgotten Adventures where I leave blending mode off because I want to take advantage of the height map functionality, where cracks can be filled in and things like that. But in this case, you probably want that terrain blending turned on. I could open up 4 more slots and get even more detailed, but I found it really is a performance impact. So I try not to do that if I can help it, mostly because these maps, like this one I'm showing you now, I make them available to my Patreon. So, I want to be able to make maps that you guys can open and manipulate. And speaking of, you can get this map, or at least when it becomes available, probably on December 3rd of 2022, depending on when you're watching this. And you can come in here and make different decisions. You can take what I've started and change some things about it. Now this room, I also want to create some variation in. So I'm cutting back that floor that I put in there already. And I'm deciding on how could I make this room more dynamic. We're going to do another overlay here. This is our same color of our semi-transparent black color. Set to 100 is our alpha channel there. And we'll do the same thing we did before. We'll draw a circle pattern around this. You notice I don't complete the circles. If I did, it would fill in the middle. I want to fill in the outside instead. So I just use 2 shapes. There's technically a way to do it with 1 shape, but my brain doesn't work that way well enough, often enough. And I just want this to look like it's right in the middle. There. I'm going to go back to my trusty medium 50% path. I'm going to make sure that my edges aren't faded there. And I sort of inadvertently started a design just by changing the floor pattern that I think I want to run with here. And so I'm going to draw some stairs. And I'm going to figure out how to kind of finish those a little bit. I don't like that my edges were so sharp, so I did go back to faded. Here I'm engaging that spline tool again just to make sure that those corners are nice and crisp. And I'm kind of liking that. Now that was set to 0.3. Now I'm going to change it to 1. 1 is generally what I use for like really tall things inside of a room, which includes also the walls. And I am going to wrap that around this piece here because I want this to look like a raised stage, or dais, or whatever you want to call it. And you can see by using that longer shadow how it really does add to the height of this piece. It really does look like it's sitting quite a ways off the top. But unless I finish it, there's something that doesn't make any sense. So I wanted to drag it all the way to the wall, make sure that that shape looked like it was really separated. This is looking pretty good. There's a lot that could happen in this room. This could be a throne room. There could be a sacrifice or an altar up there. It could simply be, leading up to an egress point. But because there's a difference in height, this automatically makes it kind of tactically a little bit more interesting as a room. I've got all these other shapes that I want to play around with here just because I like them so much. They're generic enough that they don't imply too much, right? If I wanted this to be an evil layer or something that wasn't evil, but maybe just had sort of a relationship with the scarab, right? Kind of like Egyptian culture. Just dropping this in. I've made it only semi-opaque because I want it to pick up the floor material underneath it, make it look like it was really dyed in or painted in. Now I'm just evaluating my space for what kind of ideas do I think will enhance it from here. I'm going to go back to a 50% line. And when in doubt, just go back to your rules, your design rules. Remember I'm over my other path here. And just the fact that I've got masonry, well, that just tells me I need to put some highlights in. So I'm going to use my highlight tool and do that. And do the same process I did in the other room. I'm just starting with the highlights in this case, but I'm going to go back and put shadows under them later. Just remember when you do that to make sure that you put the shadow path under the highlight path. You can see what a great job this highlight does of just creating the differentiator between the trim and the main floor. By creating these choke points, these hallways that open up or enclose, it creates a lot of intrigue for your map. Having stairs that go down and up, your players find themselves, feeling that much more nervous about, what area they're exploring, because you're forcing these changes of terrain on them. Now, you may not notice it, but I do. There's a logic problem to solve here. The steps are going up, but the trim around it does not have an elevation change. So I created just a precipitous drop here. I just used a longer shadow, creates just a significant elevation change on the edge there. That's why I did that. And it may seem really exacting, but I do want these maps to live forever, so I do try to put a level of detail in here that that I want. So even these little elements here could use some highlight. And that essentially just resolves the logical conflict between that I had a second ago. And here I'm just creating variation, right? I don't want all of my steps to look like they're the same. This room is used for something a little bit more than ceremonial maybe. So I'm just creating some variations that work. In this case, I think I do want to get those tiles all the way up to where those stairs start. You can see just quickly, dragging out that center element gives you ornamentation that you didn't have before. Now that I've got this room established, I'm going to just figure out the rest of the ornamentation for it. Anytime I see such a large area of sort of similar space, I will try to do something to dress it up. See, really simple techniques. Doesn't take a whole lot of creativity. Just making sure my shapes are symmetrical here. There's another opportunity potentially to cut something out. I like this symbol. I've used it in other places, so let's see if I can incorporate it here. Take off snap to grid, and I can get that symbol just where I want it. Just evaluating my space. Now I'm going to grunge this up. And I'm going to select these grunge pieces. I think these might be Forgotten Adventures. And I'm going to select just a very, very slight opacity. You almost can't even perceive them. Then I'm going to spam them around here. And what they're going to do is create more of that variation. I'm going to rough up the space so it's not quite so pristine. And I've set those at, I want to say that was level 100. Now we're going to paint some of that terrain in to the places we want to create some highlights and some variations. We're going to use this metallic script now because we want to, we've got this pretty consistent palette, and I want to just give it some accent. So I'm going to come back to this metallic script. It kind of looks like an elvish script. This is an asset in one of my packs. And I'm going to lay it down, and I'm going to filter my select box so I don't touch anything else. And I'm just going to put this script just a little bit around the edges of this piece. And I like that it introduces this little accent of color. So I'm going to play around a little bit more with this, try to add that accent in some other places. Another spline. I really like the effect of scripts and different varieties on these maps. Another area I think I can put some script in just to tie in that accent color. You can see it also matches pretty well that embossed medallion in the middle. Now I had this idea to decorate these stairs. I'm going to use an embossed script here. I'm going to play around with its sizing. You can see this is kind of this sort of dwarven, sort of angular script. I'm going two different directions so I don't show the same thing repeated too often. I really like this effect. It adds this texture to these stairs. It makes them look like they're important. Like I just like this space is important. Maybe that it's very old. Maybe that it's magical in nature. Right? Maybe these are protective or instructive in some way. But the detail is what I really like. These detailed steps that you're not expecting. That as a player, the players are walking through this map. It's just what makes it the map just start to be subtly interesting. You can build plot lines out of these little scripts. They could potentially try to read them and get some lore or story. Now we're on to our lighting. I'm going to use lighting very sparingly, but I want to just light the main areas, make sure that some of these areas aren't too obscured. My VTT is going to do most of the lighting. This is really just, now that Foundry's got just super excellent lighting, I like to just very, very subtly use lighting in my maps themselves. And I've decided that that one spot there is just a little bit too light, so I wanted to delete it. That grunge element was too noticeable. Now, one of my last steps here is I'm going to put some objects around. I'm going to leave, like I said before, a lot of the decoration of this space for when it gets to the VTT, because I want this space to remain flexible, but I am going to put some of the pillars in place. In this case, I'm at level 700, I'm above the walls, and I'm putting in this pillar. I think this is a Tom Kartos asset. I might be mistaken. I wish Dungeondraft did a better job of showing us where our assets are coming from. I know for a lot of you, if you're like me, you've like been like, hey, which Forgotten Adventures pack is that in? Because I don't always like to load all of the FA packs because it's so much. It really takes a long time to start Dungeon Draft. So hopefully at some point we can see where our assets come from. But I'm strategically picking places where these are going to go, where I think that a pillar would be required structurally or aesthetically in a particular space. And being very deliberate about these, the placement of these, just because everything else is going to all the other pieces are going to follow. And these aren't going to be all by themselves. I'm going to make these layered, these pillars. And you'll see what I mean in a second. I feel like this upper part's not going to need as much structural support for some reason. And now I'm using, it's almost the same exact asset, but I've made it just 2 ticks larger. And on the size scale on the left, you can get really subtly larger ticks. And this is just to, now I'm at level 400. This is to start to give you a sense of like maybe there's some design to these. It's not just one straight pillar, for example. It's bowing out a little bit as it goes down. It's very, very subtle, but the effect is to make these things look more three-dimensional. And I just like that. I like the players being able to, giving them the implication that the space is more three-dimensional than normally it would come across. Now I'm going to go down a level lower, and I'm going to increase the size yet again, just a little. This time I'm really going to try to tuck it in there. I don't want it to come out as much as the last one. I really want it to be very, very subtly poking out. Not trying to make, be able to evaluate the shape of these things, like showing them from the side. I don't want to, and it would look good anyway with the artwork I'm using here. And finally, I'm going to go with this Forgotten Adventures piece as just a cog. I like it because it's got a nice metal finish. It's got some nicks and just some subtle things around the edges. Just makes it look like I got this other material. And I like this color because it ties in with the other colors that I'm using to accent, right? So it ties in with that script, with the medallion in the middle. And it lets me show a nice color palette throughout this design. And then I've stayed consistent. So the same color palette is in the other room. So these rooms can feel like they're in the same castle, even though they might be laid out differently. There's some issues. I've got some of my paths are too high up, and they're coming over this bottom piece of the pillar. So I'm going to have to do some path cleanup later, where I'll filter down just to select my paths, and then I will push them down to the right level. You can see how the paths are coming across these metal pieces where they shouldn't. Yeah, this is looking like a pretty nice space. I think I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Once it's in the VTT and I can drop, my statues in there and some, burning cauldrons and some braziers, this might be a nice part of a castle. Or maybe I drop in some spider webs and make this like really look ruined. Here's a nice little piece from Epsilon. These are these decorative tiles. They're not meant to go across the whole floor, but they do look really, really good. And they look good with the rest of his color palette. I want these to go to the back though. I want them to be obscured behind these tiles. I just like them subtly darker. Really, really helpful if you want to just create some decoration. This goes into the VTT. I'm not going to show you guys this, but I'm going to be creating some overlay tiles that are doors. And that way I don't have to commit to where the doors are going to go within this design. In fact, I'm purposefully making it so that I can put a door really almost anywhere, because I want any of these rooms to link together however I want them to link together. And so that's why you notice I haven't put any doors on here, is because those are going to be overlay tiles. You guys can see that when the release comes out. One other technique for varying your rooms, your floors, is this sort of this tile technique. And I'm just using the medium path, shadow path, 50%, and it's at 0.1 width. And I'm just creating some variation in these tiles so that they look like they're not perfectly aligned anymore, right? The years have taken their toll to some degree. The space is not a space that was built 10 years ago. This was a space that's been around for maybe hundreds of years. And I'm going to use this technique, try to use it sparingly. I don't want too much variation in here. You certainly can. You can create a lot of variation. But this is just going to give us this very, very subtle sort of worn look. Forgot to add tiles to this room. I thought maybe I wouldn't at some point, but I think I want to make this room tiled as well. And I'm pushing that tile layer behind the black layer, and that's what gives me a more subtle tile crack there. Otherwise, that crack was a little bit too pronounced. Sending that to back, and that's what gives me that effect. I don't like that edge looks so artificial, so I'm just adding a little bit of an edge, and I'm using Epsilon's semi-faded black line to do that. Just making sure my tiles get to the end of the staircase. Just looking at little subtle inaccuracies here. A little bit cleanup work. And I'll be doing more work on these maps after this episode. You'll see them when they finally come out. And of course, with these tiles, you can't forget that this is still an opportunity to use this faded path, highlight path from Epsilon. I'm running over the other paths. I used a slightly more faded version because I don't want these to be so separated from, from the main floor. I'm still fading the ends of them. And you can see it's a pretty satisfying effect. It's looking pretty good. This looks like a great little space to combine and connect with other spaces and a bunch of other things I have planned for this release. I have plot hooks and other great little overlay tiles to be able to put in after it's in Foundry. But I hope you guys learned something from this. Let me know in the comments if you want me to come back and teach anything else. And in the meantime, have fun making your maps.